This program is brought to you by Emory University.
My name is Polly Price. I'm a faculty member here at Emory Law School, and on behalf of Dean Robert Shapiro, who could not be here this evening, I want to welcome you to the panel discussion on Georgia and Alabama immigration laws. We're very fortunate to have all of the folks here, who I will introduce in just a minute, on this very important, very timely topic. I want to thank at the outset Erin Krinsky, who is an Emory Law student. She's president of the Immigration Society here at Emory Law School, without whom this would not have occurred. She's done great work in organization, and we certainly appreciate all of that. So the Immigration Law Society at Emory is one of the sponsors, but we're also very fortunate to have the sponsorship of the American Immigration Law Association, as well as the Georgia Pacific American Bar Association. The way I would like to proceed, I will introduce everyone and then sit down, but let me begin with our moderator, Jeremy Redmond, who is at the far end. We're very fortunate to have him. He has reported for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution since 2005, covering federal stimulus spending, military affairs, and state government, immigration, and politics. He previously reported for newspapers in Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Northern Virginia. In his 15 years of reporting for newspapers, Redmond has embedded with U.S. soldiers and Marines during 3 tours in Iraq and covered state legislatures and gubernatorial elections in Virginia, Maryland, and Georgia. He has also reported on devastating fires, floods, and a hurricane while on assignments in the Southeast. Our panelists are beginning with Representative Billy Beasley, who's actually second here. Mr. Beasley was elected to the Alabama House of Representatives, District 84, in 1998. Currently, he is serving his 3rd term, having run unopposed since being elected in 1998. He serves on the Governmental Appropriations Committee and Health Committee. He is a native of Clayton, Alabama, and received his degree from Auburn University. He is a past president and member of the Alabama Pharmacy Association and recipient of pharmacy's most prestigious award. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Samuel Adday, who is sitting to Representative Beasley's right. Dr. Adday joined the University of Alabama's Center for Business and Economic Research in 1998 and assumed the position of director in 2007. In this role, he regularly speaks to groups and organizations on topics including the Alabama economy, economic policy, economic development, and workforce development. Dr. Adday works with the Center's Economic Research Program and has directed and conducted economic impact studies for numerous public and private clients across the state of Alabama. Dr. Adday has published in academic journals and is often quoted in local, regional, national, and international media. Dr. Adday is a native of the West African country of Ghana, where he obtained a Bachelor of Science in Metallurgical Engineering from the University of Science and Technology. He holds an MS in Mineral Engineering from the University of Minnesota and a PhD in Mineral Economics from the Pennsylvania State University. Representative Scott Holcomb is sitting to my immediate right. He represents District 82 in the Georgia House of Representatives, where he serves on the Public Safety and Homeland Security, Defense and Veterans Affairs, and Children and Youth Committees. Elected in 2010, Scott was named a deputy whip as a freshman. Scott began his career as a lawyer with the U.S. Army JAG Corps and was deployed overseas for operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. During those conflicts, he provided advice on the laws of war. Following his military service, Scott worked at Sutherland Asbell Brennan and focused his practice on litigation. In 2007, Scott became the general counsel for J.P. Turner & Company, an investment banking and brokerage firm based in Atlanta. Scott has taught part-time at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech and has been published by the Chicago Journal of International Law and several newspapers, including the Christian Science Monitor and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He has also provided commentary to CNN, BBC, NPR, and other media outlets. He is a principal and fellow with the Truman National Security Project and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And finally, Mary Giovanali is the director of the Immigration Policy Center. Prior to that, she served as Senior Director of Policy for the National Immigration Forum and practiced law as an attorney with the Department of Justice and Homeland Security, serving first as a trial attorney and Associate General Counsel with the INS, and following the creation of the Department of Homeland Security as an Associate Chief Counsel for United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. Ms. Giovanali specialized in asylum and refugee law, focusing on the impact of general immigration laws on asylees. In 2005, she became the senior advisor to the Director of Congressional Relations at USCIS. She was also awarded a congressional fellowship from USCIS to serve for a year in Senator Edward Kennedy's office, where she worked on comprehensive immigration reform and refugee issues. So that's our panelist. I would like to introduce one additional person, and that is Sarah Hawk, who's going to give you an overview of the legislation that we are discussing today. Sarah Hawk is an attorney in the Atlanta office of Ogletree Deakins. Ms. Hawk provides immigration counsel to numerous corporate clients and is a frequent speaker nationally and regionally on business immigration issues. Ms. Hawk is also the president of the Georgia Asian Pacific Bar Association and an executive board member of the National Association of Asian American Professionals and counsel to the Philippine American Chamber of Commerce. Besides her work at Ogletree Deakins, Ms. Hawk also represents pro bono immigration workshops for various groups, including leaders in the Asian community and newcomers to the U.S. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Sarah Hawk.
I would like to recognize our chapter president of AILA here, David Solloway. David, would you like to come up and say anything now about AILA and the mission of AILA or our committee here tonight? Thank you, David.
Good evening. For many Americans, immigration law is one of the most important issues facing our society, and within that area of law, state anti-immigrant laws are some of the most contentious issues. Few forums exist for serious educational and non-emotional discussion of that very contentious matter. Organizing a highly credentialed and well-balanced panel, what would have been a remarkably well-balanced panel had some of our invited guests attended who we had expected. This takes a lot of more energy and thought and time than one might expect, and on behalf of the Georgia-Alabama chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, a proud co-sponsor of this event, I want to acknowledge and thank 4 of our members for their roles in organizing this event. First, Amna Shirazi, chair of our chapter's advocacy committee, Carolina Antonini, Clary Tedrow, and Sarah Hawk, who has already been introduced to you. And I also wish to acknowledge and thank Aaron Krinsky, president of Emory's Immigration Law Society and Federalist Society. And I also want to thank Emory Law School for its generous accommodations as well as for its professional and educational leadership. Thank you.
We're also going to have written questions submitted to Carolina and Amna, so those will be submitted after the panel, and then we'll be choosing which questions to ask from those submitted questions, so feel free during the panel to go ahead and write down your questions. Now, Jeremy and I are going to take turns on the state immigration laws overview for Georgia and Alabama. Practicing business immigration law, we are seeing the trend in E-Verify over many states. There is a proposal to mandate E-Verify nationwide. And as you can see, state level, the number of immigration laws has really increased in the past few years. Okay, Jeremy, do you want to take over for Georgia?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Just briefly, Georgia's immigration law followed Arizona's. Arizona passed its law in 2010, and then we saw several states follow suit afterwards. In fact, using just verbatim language from Arizona's law and their laws. Georgia's House Bill 87, as it's also known, was passed in May by the legislature. The governor signed it in April, and soon afterwards we had the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, ACLU, and various other groups sued to block it in federal court. District Court in Atlanta blocked parts of it in June, so there are two sections. The most controversial part, Sections 7 and 8, are on hold. We'll go into a little bit about those a little bit later. This month, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals heard an appeal from the state on this law and has decided not to act on Georgia's law, citing the fact that the Supreme Court will take up this case next month. So a little bit more about the law itself. It's called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Enforcement Act of 2011. That's a mouthful. It's 27 pages long, 23 sections, and some of the parts, real quickly, the two ones that have been put on hold, the two sections that have been put on hold by the courts, one would authorize police to question you about your immigration status, say during a traffic stop, and take you to jail if you're determined to be in the country illegally. The other big section that's been put on hold, the other most controversial one, is one that would punish you pretty severely for knowingly harboring, transporting, or inducing an undocumented person in the United States, or in Georgia, excuse me. Both those sections have been put on hold. There are also requirements for businesses to use E-Verify. There is a penalty for using a fake ID to get a job in Georgia. And there was a new state panel that was created to enforce the state's immigration laws. Those are some of the highlights of the law.
I would invite many members who support the law to come and speak tonight, one of whom, Ben Vinson, who's the chair of that Enforcement Review Board, is unable to be here tonight, but sends his regrets. He does want to state they have two new cases in which they will be reviewing to see if there have been violations of the Georgia immigration law. And so we'll see some update on that from him, I'm sure. Now, with Alabama, it has been said it's the most severe immigration state law in the U.S. And besides the immigration provisions that Georgia has, Alabama is unique that it also requires companies to use E-Verify. But it also requires proof of citizenship when renewing or applying for a driver's license, a public benefit. It also mandates that all public schools check the immigration status of students. And it also criminalizes activities deemed helping an undocumented person, such as giving them a ride. So these provisions have been very serious in Alabama, and Dr. Addy from Alabama and Senator Beasley will be talking about those provisions. We want to give you an overview of some of these provisions and didn't want to take too much time, so we do have the PowerPoints available. And now I think we should just go right to the panel with Jeremy moderating.
As I mentioned, I've been reporting for newspapers for about 18 years now, and the last 7 at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And I've covered just about everything in my career, from city councils to school boards to cops, courts, to politics, the presidential election, to war in Iraq. And when I got this assignment in 2010 to cover immigration, I wondered if it was going to be really exciting. It sounded kind of arcane and boring to me, to be honest with you, and I was a little worried. I didn't know much about immigration. And I started on the beat in late 2010, and it was a great time because House Bill 87 happened. And it was a gift that keep on giving right there. And I don't mean that pejoratively about the law, but I meant it in terms of the news aspect of it. It just keeps generating news. You know, the introduction of the law, debate over it in the legislature, the governor signing it, being contested in the courts, now the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Issues will come before the Supreme Court next month. So I've really enjoyed it to the fact that I was covering Newt Gingrich with the team of HAC reporters on the presidential election trail, and I asked my editor to make sure that I would be back in time to cover the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals argument on Georgia and Alabama's law this month. That's how much of a geek I've become on immigration. I thought maybe my experience helped suit me to be the moderator for this panel, but something that might also help is that I'm a referee, and I referee lacrosse, and I've been doing it for 5 years. So I brought a couple things with me in case there's any problems tonight. I was going to throw this flag if I witness any personal fouls. I'll do a play-on situation, and if the ball drops, then I'll blow the whistle. And I brought the whistle just in case. I've got questions for all of our panelists here tonight. I want to hear from each of you tonight. We have an esteemed panel with a lot of experience on this issue. The first question I have is, last year when I was covering this issue with House Bill 87 in Georgia, we had the president come out and sound off on this issue. It was in an interview with a local TV reporter, and the president said, and I quote, he says, of House Bill 87, he says, it's a mistake for states to try to do this piecemeal. We can't have 50 different immigration laws around the country. So I want to ask Representative Holcomb, you voted against House Bill 87. You agree with the president on this issue, and why can't states adopt and enforce their own anti-illegal immigration laws? What are the implications of that? And really what we're getting at is foreign diplomacy. Can you address that subject, Representative?
I'll certainly try. Thank you all for hosting this tonight and for being here. For those of you who are either students or practitioners, and if you ever find yourself wondering, what was the legislature thinking when they passed those laws? I can tell you that I have that thought every single day as somebody who's down there. But on this very important subject of immigration, I absolutely agree with the sentiment that the president stated in terms of it is wrong national policy for us to go on a path where we have potentially 50 different state laws on immigration, and then this patchwork which people need to look at and figure out what is our national immigration policy. While there's certainly disagreement in terms of the solution for immigration policy, we all know what the problem is. And the problem is that the federal government has not acted in a way that has really cured this problem. The way that I viewed it, and after carefully considering House Bill 87 and reading through it, was that the best policy is to force the federal government to take this issue on. Opponents, which I'll also say what's interesting is they very rarely show up in public to defend this bill, and I'm not sure why that is. I've been invited to 3 panels to speak with those who support the bill, and every time they've been invited well in advance, and every time they've had other things to do. I received a lot of pushback for my vote against it because there are a lot of people that are in favor of it, and I think what's really important is to have a healthy exchange of ideas, and it's unfortunate that we don't have people who really believe in this to share their side of this policy debate. So when you read through House Bill 87, what jumps out at you is how many times the word federal is used. It's there throughout. What also jumps out is that it places an obligation to fulfill and execute federal immigration law on our state and local governments, which I think is interesting in terms of many of those on the right would say federal government needs to stay out of state business. They tend to like to cite the 10th Amendment. And here we have clearly in law, Supreme Court has clearly stated this, that it is a federal responsibility. And so we're taking a federal responsibility and saying we, as the state and local governments, will take on this responsibility. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It particularly doesn't make much sense when you think about the fiscal climate that we're in right now, where our state and local governments are already overburdened with the responsibilities that they have. And here we're saying, let's take on a responsibility that's not ours and place that burden on our state and local government. What's really unbelievable about where this law was at the beginning, and I made fun of them in my House speech, and they ultimately took it out, was they had private causes of action in one of the early versions of this bill, which would have allowed citizens to sue a state or local government for not fulfilling federal immigration law, which would of course cost your state and local governments money to defend, and if they lost, the person who sued for this enforcement would have received attorney's fees. So when Georgia has plenty of other issues, this was the great wisdom that was put forward by our General Assembly. So in terms of the national issue and why can't states do this, I think some of the examples that I just cited are exactly why. You're going to have inanity running wild across this country, and that's not healthy for where we need to go. Our immigration policy speaks to our values as a nation, and it speaks to our competitiveness going forward. One of the things that makes America strong, and I think will keep America strong, is the fact that we have strong immigration. If you look at countries that are not doing very well and that have declining populations, they don't have very good immigration systems. So this is something that we should be proud of. This is something that we definitely need to fix, but it's something that we need to fix at the national level so we have an overall federal landscape and not this patchwork of 50 different states.
Thank you. This question is for Senator Beasley. Lawmakers in both Georgia and Alabama's legislatures have introduced bills to repeal House Bill 87 and House Bill 56. Just recently, we had Democrats in Georgia's legislature introduce a bill to repeal portions of House Bill 87. It's not going really anywhere, Representative Holcomb, I don't think. But in your bill, Senate Bill 41 would seek to repeal the entire House Bill 56 in Alabama. Tell me the status of your bill, and given that both chambers in the Alabama legislature are controlled by Republicans, what are the realistic chances of this happening?
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to also tell you that we appreciate the opportunity to be here and to discuss the harsh immigration law that's passed not only in Alabama but is also passed in Georgia. And I'd also like to recognize my wife, Rebecca, who is also the mayor of our town of Clayton, and she's also the editor of our local newspaper. It's no question that to be able to repeal the most harsh immigration law that was passed in Alabama is an uphill battle, but I certainly feel that for the best interests of the state of Alabama, we need to repeal this law because it has affected not only undocumented immigrants in our state, but has also affected every other Alabamian in our state. And I'm hoping that the members of the Republican Party in the state of Alabama will just stop and think that, you know, when you pass a law that is so harsh and so cruel that you're affecting every business in the state of Alabama, you're affecting all the schools in the state of Alabama, you're affecting the economy in the state of Alabama, and you're affecting our ability to recruit on the worldwide basis in economic development. Alabama, since the middle 90s, has been renowned around the world in recruiting automobile industry into our state. We brought Mercedes in, we brought Honda in, we brought Hyundai in, and we have a Toyota engine up in North Alabama. And just recently, since this law was passed, when they stop on traffic violations, they stop the person from Mercedes, and he didn't have any papers, and they take him to jail. Well, the first person they find out what they've done, the first person they call, they get in touch with the governor of Alabama. Well, it wasn't very long before they released this person, but it never should have happened in the first place. And the same thing happened with an executive with the Honda corporation, that he was stopped for a traffic violation, and he didn't have his papers, and the same thing happened, and naturally they released him. But the economy in Alabama has been hurt. The University of Alabama released a study that said in the state of Alabama we're going to lose $1 million a day, and over a period of a few years, anywhere from $2 billion to $10 billion in loss of economy. I really believe the whole purpose of the immigration law in Alabama is to make life so miserable for the undocumented folks in our state that they'll just pack up and leave. Because if you profile their children in school and they have to show papers, and many of the families in Alabama are, one may be undocumented, and then the spouse may be a legal resident, and the children in these families are legal residents. So it's creating a very bad symbol for the state of Alabama. It's an image of the state of Alabama that takes us back to the 50s and 60s when racial discrimination was running rampant in our state. And here we are in the year 2011, and we pass a very stringent, cruel, mean-spirited anti-immigration law. And it's going to set our state back again in the areas of how do we treat human beings in the state of Alabama. But in order to have success in repealing this law, it's not going to be easy, but the folks who voted for the law, I think if they realize they've made a mistake, they have to have enough courage to be able to say, I'm wrong, and I want to correct a bad piece of legislation.
A follow on that, Senator, hasn't the governor and maybe even some of the sponsors said that they went too far and want to pull back in some areas?
Well, several members of the Alabama Senate have said that if they had realized that we were going to have the unintended consequences of this law, that I think I would have cast a different vote.
And Representative Holcomb, didn't we see some of that here? For instance, the bill that's pending in the Senate, or just passed the Senate, went over to the House, that would ban undocumented students from Georgia colleges, has some cleanup language in there for House Bill 87, does it not? Including letting people apply for public benefits with their ID by fax or email instead of in person. Those sort of things that were unintended that they're trying to fix now. Isn't there some of that going on?
There is, and to the point of unintended consequences, I would submit that that's nonsense. It was very predictable what was going to happen. The economic impact, which I didn't oppose the law on economics because I don't think that you should excuse law breaking for economics, but the economic impact was known. Everybody knew that there was going to be an economic impact from what was going to happen. And to the point about the executives from the auto companies, at least one of the speeches in the Georgia House cited exactly an example like that. So while policymakers often rightly are criticized for not thinking through the second and third order effects, all these things were on the table. So I would say that those who voted in support of this did this with full knowledge of what was going to happen. They knew it was going to be lousy, but they did it anyway. And I would say that they did it because of politics. They wanted to rile up a certain part of the population and do what may be smart politics, but is really lousy policy.
And I want to reemphasize something our organizers said at the outset, that they invited the author of House Bill 87, Matt Ramsey, who did not respond, and we had several other proponents who were invited who chose not to attend from Alabama and Georgia. So in the interest of balance, those folks were invited, and unfortunately they were not able to be here tonight. This is a good segue into Dr. Addy. I want to ask, Doctor, you've had proponents of the laws argue that they will save taxpayer money by protecting, taxpayer-funded resources with these laws. The jails, the courts, the schools, the hospitals, and something Representative Holcomb was alluding to was, and I wanted to follow on that, is in Georgia there was a study done by the agricultural industry, which is the state's largest industry, that industry is estimated to lose roughly $70-some-odd million and lost crops because the migrant workers who would normally be collecting those crops fled the state after Georgia passed House Bill 87. Now, Dr. Addy, you've done a similar study, not just on agriculture, but a little more, much more broader than what we did here. What's wrong with the argument that the proponents have made in this regard? And can you summarize some of your findings?
Do have a 6-slide show that I would like to show to answer those questions. And I think two representatives here are right. You don't have to think too much to realize that there are unintended consequences of these bills. Basically, for anyone to consider this bill and think that there are benefits to it which would outweigh any costs doesn't really make sense from an economic standpoint. I can only say, as an economist, whether it has a net cost or a net benefit. And bottom line, economies are about people. So if you adopt a policy or a law, regulation, anything that reduces the population in any area, you are going to hurt yourself economically. There's no question. Because innovation, inventions, everything comes from people. And it's as simple as that. So you don't want to push away your people. I think I would state that first, the issue on illegal immigration, just the adjective illegal, makes it an emotionally charged issue for most people because we think that these people have broken the law in the first place, so they've done something wrong. But I think Representative Holcomb mentioned something about values as a nation. And just before I get into the economics, you ready? Okay. That basically this country stands for freedom and care. And so and from an economic standpoint, that would mean that you should have a heart. I know it sounds like a softie, but bottom line, we have programs in this country that enable us to forgive people and give people second chances, especially when it's very clear from the research that immigration benefits the country. As they mentioned early on, all the industrialized countries with bad immigration policies, quote unquote, are suffering economically because they don't have the population growth to support economic growth. Okay, good. Well, can we start from right? I make next one, please. Thank you. Bottom line, economies are about people, the institutions that we create, I call them rules of the game, and property. The property that we inherit, we come to meet at birth, etc. But it takes the people to make use, to either put the institutions in place or make use of the property. So anything that reduces people and our income then reduces the size of the economy. It's as simple as that. So if your population is up here, your demand in your economy would be here. Your supply has to meet it. If you shrink the population, guess what? Supply has to shrink. Very simple. So when the law was being considered, I actually laughed because I thought nobody in their right mind would pass this. I'm originally from Ghana. You can hear the accent. It's been an education. That sometimes we do things which are not good for us, and that's all across. The benefits of the law, as claimed by the proponents, are 4 places, and I would say 1, savings from services. The 2 main services we count are typically healthcare and education. On that, all the data is showing that, 1, on education, most of the children of illegal immigrants are themselves legal. And the trend is more legalization of these children. So actually, there's not much savings there. And going forward, there wouldn't be much savings either. So, and even there, we didn't have data on that. So the law tried to collect data on illegal children of illegal immigrants. So that tells you something, one. On health, health is a public good. All you have to think about is contagion. Some diseases pass on through different media. So you basically would have to actually treat any sick person who is visiting, legally or illegally. It's more efficient for the economy than to let things be. So that's on the savings side. The next benefit that is often mentioned is increased public safety. And there, you really have to ask the question, do we commit more crime? Do we citizens and legal residents commit crime at a higher rate or lower rate than illegal immigrants? And I don't think anybody has the answer to that. In fact, one could argue that because of their status as illegal, they would rather be under the radar. So they are not likely to commit crime as much as us. If we have the third benefit that is often mentioned too is increased integrity of our government programs. The same question is there. Do we use government programs more fraudulently or less fraudulently than illegal immigrants? I don't think that anyone has the answer because we don't have the data on that. So again, these benefits are possible, but who knows? There's a final benefit that they often claim that this would be more business. There would be more business for legal immigrants and citizens. Now, yes, there will be. For those who did not use illegal immigrants, they would have opportunities. But that doesn't take away from the aggregate distraction or shrinkage in the economy. So yes, some people will gain, but there will be many more losers, including the rest of us who benefit from their services and demand. So there's that. So those are the benefits, and I think the benefits are clearly not guaranteed, but the costs are real, because once you have a law, you have to implement it, you have to defend it in the courts, and you have to enforce it. It's as simple as that. In Alabama, we actually are creating, with the law, a new unit to police this. So is that right? So basically, you're creating real costs. That's one. The other cost was the unintended cost on people, where you require documentation of citizenship to get basic benefit and basic services. People had to go back home to find birth certificates. There were long lines at the courthouses, etc. So these are issues that I don't know if they were really not considered. I think our folks were only looking at making a very strict law and putting it in place. There is also what Representative Beasley mentioned, that the image effects, the negative image that this projects on the state, especially after 2 decades of, outstanding economic development achievements. And I'll tell you, Alabama's per capita income has risen to about 84% of the nation's, when it was far lower before. So you make these strides, and then one law pushes it back. But for me, what I could estimate are what I call the demand reduction aspect on the people. So what I do is I just I went to the Department of Homeland Security and the Pew Research Center for data on illegal immigrants. The Pew Research Center provides it on every state. And so, where are we now? Good, thank you. So I went there and said, okay, I need to do this study to show these people really that they weren't considering all the economic costs. The Pew Research Center actually has one of the very few fellows of the American Statistical Association. This is a body of about 18,000 people. Only 60 have that designation. Okay, so if I'm going to go somewhere for data, I'm going to go to some place that's credible like that. So that I use their data. I use data from the Department of Commerce. I use the data from the Department of Homeland Security, and also data from our own Alabama State employment offices. And the assumptions I make are based on these data. One, the Pew Research Center says we have 120,000 people, and I use 2010 as basis because you need a year for which you have a complete set of data to do the analysis. So they say we had 120,000 illegal immigrants, 95,000 in the workforce, and so I chose a range of 40 to 80,000. One, because our law was not kicking them out of the U.S. In fact, they could just cross the border into Tennessee or Florida. So, and all the anecdotes showed that there were large overnight movements of people out of the state. Now, it's also possible the people could go underground within the state, but the economic losses will still be there because they are no longer working or they have lower incomes. And so there's that. I also use Mexico because most illegal immigrants, a large percentage of them are known to be Mexicans. So I use Mexico's per capita income relative to the US's, which is about 19.3% in 2010. And I round it off to 20%. So I assume that these people send 20% of their money home to help their families or whoever. And I also assume that they make between 15,000 to 35,000 a year, which is less than the average 39,000 per Alabama worker for that year. And when you run through that, what you find is that the impacts are basically on GDP for the states, 2.3 to 10.8 billion for every year that this number of people will be absent. And I think the slide one slide shows the table of if it's 40,000 or 60,000 or 80,000. So the numbers are there. It also shows for earnings to people, we would lose about a range of 1.2 to 5.8 billion for every year. And in taxes, we would lose between 57 to 265 million in income and sales tax alone, no other taxes. Income and sales tax comprise about 65% of our tax collections. And on that, I will add one more thing, that typically we think illegal immigrants don't pay taxes, but they do. And because they are lower income, actually in states like ours, they sometimes pay much more of their income in taxes than our very rich people. And it's the truth. ITEP has done studies on tax payments by different income groups and also by illegal immigrants. So there's that to consider. I have been criticized as not providing solutions, and so I'm just mentioning to Mary that I think, one, I'm of the school that believes that you take the log out of your eye to see the speck in somebody else's eye. So we first have to admit our faults. How did we come about to have this large group of illegal immigrants? It means, one, we are not doing internal monitoring properly, for people who outstay visas, and we don't have proper border security or port of entry security. But those alone will bring about shrinkage because it reduces the number of people. What we also don't have is, despite the fact that our immigration policy is better than some other countries, our legal immigration programs are too small. Our businesses have complained about this for years. So we need to do three things: border security, internal monitoring, and expansion of the legal immigration programs in the States.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate that. Now, for Mary, I want to ask, some of the supporters of this legislation have suggested, why can't the immigrants just wait in line for their turn? And if we were to allow them to come here illegally, they're getting in front of somebody else who is in line. That's not fair. You have a long history in government, and you have a lot of expertise in this area and have written about this subject. Can you tell me about this argument and what's wrong, what's the fallacy in that argument there?
Sure. I'm going to start with a movie analogy and end with a game analogy. So how many of you have seen The Wedding Singer, the movie? And you remember the bad guy, Glenn Guglia. He's going to marry sweet Drew Barrymore. And he is so proud of all of his technology, including his cell phone, which starts about here and goes up to about here, because that was in late 80s, what cell phones looked like, right? Well, our legal immigration system, the numbers that govern are how many people are allowed to come into the country, has not really changed since 1990. So roughly the time of The Wedding Singer and the gigantic, mobile phones and, no thoughts of iPads and iPhones and all of the amazing technology we have, our world has changed dramatically, both in terms of how we interact with people, the tools we use, the movement of people from place to place, our interconnectedness in terms of the economies and such, and yet our immigration system really is frozen in time. And so very frequently you do get this argument from folks, and one of the things that we do at the Immigration Policy Center in D.C. Is spend a lot of our time sort of breaking down the myths about immigration, and this is certainly one of them, that, well, people must be here unlawfully because they want to be, because it's easier, you can game the system, all these kinds of things. And in fact, we simply don't have the visas available really to create a system where people can come in a pretty regularized way lawfully. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't coming. We have roughly 1 million people or so who come in lawfully every year. But there's a very, very strong correlation between the strength of the economy and the number of people who enter the country unlawfully. In fact, while I think there's no doubt that there has been a huge buildup on the border, there has been a lot more money put into the border, and that's had some impact, the real reason that immigration, new unlawful immigration has decreased, and it has to do with the lack of jobs in the U.S., and with the fact that basically Mexico's population in particular is slowing down, and that people are starting to have greater economic opportunities in other parts of the world. So there are all of these things happening that are in many ways reducing that initial push. But the minute the economy really starts taking off and we can't fill those jobs anymore, unless we've actually created a system that works for people, we're going to have these problems again. So I just, if I can, just want to step back a little bit more and say that, you can sort of trace the history of immigration. You can sort of put your finger down at any point in time, and you see we have sort of a love-hate relationship in this country with the immigrant. This generation's immigrants hates the new immigrants, and so on and so on and so forth. It's cyclical, and it's also often tied to like strong periods of anti-immigration sentiment or correlate with bad economic times or other times of great uncertainty in the country. So you really do have this sort of ebb and flow, and it's one of the things that you kind of have to keep in mind, that we happen to be in one of those ebb periods in a way. Because there's been some really dramatic changes in sort of the makeup of the country and the demographics of the country. And it's no real surprise, frankly, that the popularity of these anti-immigrant laws are really, taking hold in states that have had a large influx of new immigrants in the last decade or so. In fact, I think that you have available to you, or it may be in the back of the room, I'm not sure, some of the state fact sheets that the Immigration Policy Center produces, and we try to give you little little tidbits that you can use to really talk about this issue in a thoughtful way. Well, one of the first things we talk about is how the share of the foreign-born changes, and we do this state by state. So I have the Georgia one in front of me. The foreign-born share of Georgia's population rose from 2.7% in 1990 to 7.1% in 2000 to 9.7% in 2010. That's 942,000 people. Now, a good chunk of those folks are naturalized citizens and LPRs, but, you know, roughly 400,000 or so are undocumented. And that is overwhelming psychologically. Not so much in terms of the real numbers, but it has an impact when suddenly that little corner store is now a bodega, you know, that kind of thing. That change really affects people. Whereas in New York, the corner store that was the Italian restaurant and then becomes the Chinese restaurant and then becomes the Ethiopian restaurant, there's a certain rhythm to it that even though there's anti-immigrant sentiment in a lot of the big urban areas, it's sort of conditioned or softened, I guess, by this sense that, oh, this is just the next wave. And so a lot of sociologists have suggested that the popularity of these kinds of laws really is tied to the fact that states are dealing with new issues and new questions about change and are really, there are underlying things that have nothing to do so much with the fact that we're dealing with illegal immigration as that we're dealing with change. So I'll stop there for right now, but what I was going to say, because I promised a game analogy at the end, was that I think that the theme that we're hearing from everybody thus far is that when you try to focus on the immigration issue in isolation, whether it's through state law, whether it's through, you know, just one piece of the puzzle, whether it's you know, not dealing enough with the border, not looking enough at visas, things like that, when you try to deal with it in isolation, you're really not going to be able to solve the problem. And so it's a lot like a Rubik's Cube. You can get one side right, and even that's pretty hard. But if you only focus on the one side, the rest of the sides are not going to line up unless you're doing everything kind of in common. So that kind of goes back to the whole point of the need to think about this in terms of a national dialogue. It's the whole need to think about the supply and demand issues and what happens when you push people out of one state and where do they go. So really we're in like the Hunger Games. We're in this giant game and we're the ones who are, you know, struggling to get it right. And if we don't all work together, it's not going to happen.
I got to come up with an 80s reference now, but we're in a law school, so I got to ask a legal question. Professor Price and Mary, if you want to chime in on this too, is the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be taking up Arizona's law, Senate Bill 1070, next month. What are the implications for Georgia, Alabama, and any other states regarding these similar immigration laws? Several similarities in these laws. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals this month said they were going to wait on Georgia until after the Supreme Court rules because they were so similar. There are issues of preemption at stake here as well. Professor Price, could you address this? And Mary, again, if you want to chime in, that'd be great.
Sure. Of course, the centerpiece of the federal government's challenge to the Arizona statute is preemption. And the concept of preemption, as you know, is that these state laws are preempted by a federal presence in the field. And there are a couple of forms this comes in. There's express preemption, where the statute directly is displacing the state law. But there's also implied preemption, and that's where sort of the breadth and the depth of federal authority indicates an intention to occupy the field. And so the arguments that in immigration law the federal government occupies the field have a very long historical pedigree. There's also conflict preemption where state and federal law impose conflicting duties, or state law otherwise conflicts with the achievement of federal goals. So in terms of the federal government's authority in immigration law based upon plenary power doctrine and some other, it's clear that in many areas, of course, the federal government's authority is going to be paramount here. But the problem is, or at least the hazy line, is that while we admit there's exclusive federal authority over immigration and naturalization, states have also historically had the power to regulate their internal affairs under the traditional state police power doctrine. So these are the issues that the Supreme Court will take up in its oral arguments in April. And the reason that we are sort of looking so closely at it in Georgia and Alabama and so forth, of course, is the similarity of these statutes. The method is very similar in terms of, even if the language is a little bit different in terms of the, for Georgia, for the ability to stop and to investigate status and detain. And then, of course, Georgia adds some provisions that Arizona doesn't have, and then Alabama goes even further, as we've already heard. So the 11th Circuit recognizes, of course, that because these laws are so similar, that whatever the Supreme Court says in the Arizona case is going to govern the outcome in Georgia.
Mary, did you want to add anything on this score?
Sure. The one thing that I would add would be that the challenges in Arizona are not just the challenges that are raised at the Supreme Court right now. There's a whole host of other lawsuits percolating through the system that challenge on other aspects of constitutional law, so civil rights issues and questions of discrimination, questions of I'm trying to remember, I'm blanking right now, but just a whole range of things, and those types of lawsuits have been replicated in other states as well. So really, it ain't over till it's over in this case, and the Supreme Court's decision, if they were to find that these kinds of laws are preempted, I think really a lot of the folks who believe in these laws will just go back to the drawing board and try other parts, because there are many, many parts that won't have yet made it up to the Supreme Court. The school provisions and the contracting with government provisions and things like that. So we are far from being done with this in sort of the litigation world, and I think regardless of the outcome at the Supreme Court, the question really has to be, okay, one way or the other, it's a bad idea to do this, regardless of what the presumption jurisdiction ends up being. This is a bad idea for all of the reasons people have been raising here, and there's just tons more. So it's a debate that really is not going to end until Congress gets its act together and attacks immigration in a really systematic way.
I've got a few more questions for the panel, then we're going to go to the questions from the audience, so we'll make these quicker. I want to come back to Representative Holcomb in our Georgia legislature, which, like in Alabama, is controlled by Republicans. They've got another bill, Senate Bill 458, that we referenced earlier. This bill, the main part of it, would ban undocumented people from Georgia's public colleges. It wouldn't affect private institutions like Emory, but it would affect University of Georgia and so on. And it's passed the Senate. It just passed the House committee and is headed to the Rules Committee and then on to the House floor if it gets out of rules. Heard the House Speaker say that he really wasn't interested in going back in and tinkering with House Bill 87 or doing really more on immigration law, and the governor has said the same thing. Ramsey, the sponsor of House Bill 87, though, said he was amenable to this because it fixes some things in his law, like cleaning up some of the language on using ID. But the main part about banning illegal immigrants from colleges is happening in 2 other states, South Carolina and one other, I can't remember. But now, again, going to rules, Representative Holcomb, tell me about the prospects for this bill. Where do you see this going here in the legislature?
It will pass.
And why do you have that confidence to say that?
Because they don't care. So, I think it's unfortunate, and to the point about Congress getting its act together, I certainly wouldn't hold one's breath for that to happen. And the really sad thing about this is that the solution to comprehensive national immigration reform, which is something that we so desperately need, because what we have now undermines the rule of law, it threatens our national security, and it rewards those who break the law because they get to pay people less money than would otherwise happen in the marketplace. But to Mary's point, we need to fix the number of people that can come into the country, and then there's also a choice. For those who are the most hardcore, if you take their line of argument to its logical conclusion, which I know is a bit much, suggesting that there's logic with that. But if you try to do that, what you come to is massive deportation. And think about what that would look like in terms of the United States. That's not the United States that I would want to live in, where for 11 million people we're setting up an administrative architecture to deport those people. So if we're really honest, about the answer for immigration reform, you have to have some type of path to citizenship. I know in politics it's a taboo word to say amnesty, but that's the only thing that works. And I get the moral hazard problem, I get all of that, but if we're really honest about solving this problem, it's the only solution. So to higher education, I don't even see this one as a close call. I can understand the debates over HB 87. I can understand, I certainly don't agree with the proponents of the bill, but on denying people access to higher education, I'll be real candid here. I think it's just stupid. And the reason why I think it's stupid is it wouldn't actually impact the University of Georgia or Georgia Tech. It only affects those public schools where there's not full enrollment, which means that Georgians are not being displaced. So these students are not taking the seats of anybody else. Moreover, they're paying higher tuition rates, so they're not being subsidized by taxes. And if these individuals are here, and who knows what their ultimate end will be, isn't it smart to have them be as smart as possible? Isn't it smart policy to have them get educated? The Supreme Court, rightly or wrongly, has ruled that they have a right to primary and secondary education. The question of collegiate education has never come into play, but it just strikes me as being really dumb policy and really mean-spirited. I spoke against it in the House committee, and interestingly, I used Alabama as a reason for us not to do it, because I had just read The Economist, and I know that's wild that a Democrat reads The Economist, but I read The Economist, and they had a one-page article in there that said that what Alabama did by being so draconian was killing and crushing their economy. And so I brought that forward to the House committee, and the chairman did the right thing. He tabled it. But then the Senate side, they want to push this because they want to be able to say that they're tough on illegal immigration, when in fact it does nothing. It does nothing.
Thank you, thank you. For Senator Beasley, it's a good segue into education, because Alabama's law has another provision that would require public schools in that state to check the immigration status of anyone seeking to enroll in those schools. Now, we know in the Supreme Court, Plyler versus Doe, the case that determined that you are entitled to a public and free education in the United States regardless of your immigration status. So undocumented children are entitled to a public education here. What are the implications of that provision, which is on hold, by the way, in the courts, has been put on hold? If that were to take effect, what could that do? And what has been the fallout in Alabama from that provision?
It would be a terrible thing to do, to deny a child the privilege to obtain an education. And the hold that the courts have on that right now, the schools are not having to do any profile children. But I think it'd be just a tragedy to deny any child in the state of Alabama the opportunity to receive an education.
Well, hasn't, I guess one of the concerns I was getting at is that by requiring the people to show their immigration status, that would somehow deter them from coming. They don't want to disclose their immigration status.
Well, that's true. When the law was first passed and enacted, the fear of the young children, I mean, they stayed away from school because they were being discriminated against, they were being profiled, and so out of fear, they stayed out of school. So the enrollment dropped drastically in the state where there were young elementary schools.
I want to close with this question for the panel, and this is for anyone who wants to take on this meaty subject. Is a lot of the proponents of these laws say, hey, you know, we wouldn't have to do this if the federal government had done its job and sealed the nation's borders and kept the illegal immigrants out. We need comprehensive immigration reform. Why can't we get comprehensive immigration reform done? What are the obstacles? What is the prediction for this session of Congress? They all laugh. No one wants to take this question.
No, I mean, I don't know if...
Go ahead, Mary.
There's a couple of things going on. I was extraordinarily lucky in 2007 to actually, be working for Senator Kennedy when we were trying to pass the 2007 bill. And so I got this education in the behind-the-scenes politics. And I'll tell you that people seem to think that it's the legalization issues that really are the things that always make immigration, comprehensive reform of any kind, crash and burn. It really isn't. There are folks who don't like the idea of legalization, but I think as Representative Holcomb said, people get pretty practical when they're kind of actually at the table and trying to figure something out, and they're like, okay, we'll make it hard. We'll make people pay a lot, we'll make it a process that lasts for 13 years, we'll do all these different things, but ultimately, you're able to get to a point where people agree that, all right, we've got to do something about the folks who are here. And you're usually able to get to some agreement where nobody's really happy, but about how much money you should spend on the border, how much money you should spend on interior enforcement, things like that. The real sticking point ultimately becomes, how do we bring people in for the future, what those numbers should be, whether they should be permanent or temporary. And then you have all kinds of, ideological dances and games going back and forth. It's often characterized as a business-labor split. It's a lot more complicated than that because it often has to do with, there are some people who fundamentally believe that, like I said, those 1990 numbers, they cannot be touched. So anything that you do to increase the overall number of people you bring in has to somehow or other be that's just seen as untouchable. And you really can't solve the problem without expanding the number of folks that you want to bring in, at least during the good times. So then a lot of the fights become, okay, well, let's say that we're willing to increase the numbers slightly to at least get rid of massive backlogs that exist for people who are already in line to try to get in lawfully. Then what? What do people come in and they get the opportunity to come in as a lawful permanent resident? Do they come in as a temporary worker but with the opportunity maybe to eventually transition over into something more permanent? Do we let them come in and stay indefinitely but only if they agree never to want to become a citizen? Sort of this whole thing that you've heard a few people say, oh, well, we can do something like the DREAM Act for undocumented high school students, but we wouldn't actually ever let them become citizens. Those are the kinds of fights that are going on constantly behind the scenes. And in a lot of ways, it's something that Sam said, we don't know enough about what our immigration needs are to be able to kind of argue really persuasively for, okay, we need an increase of 10%, or we need to do this, or we need to do that. We don't have a lot of the tools we need to be able to have that conversation in a smart and effective way. And so then instead it just ends up being all this really sort of, nasty, polarized finger pointing.
If I may add to that, and that's true, but from this economist's perspective, we can have guiding principles on dealing with a problem. As they mentioned earlier, my first degree and second degree both are in engineering, so I like to solve problems. But optimality has to be a guiding principle. And if you don't have a starting point, we have enough historical data to tell us that we can absorb this much and still remain the #1 economy in the world. And you can always adjust it going forward, step by step. So you allow for flexibility as another guiding principle. So optimality, flexibility, we have to make sure it's fair so that those in line can go through the process, and then those who are already here illegally, get to pay fines to get a little, at least punishment for having broken the initial law. But there's a path. So there's a fairness that we can look at, and we can look at sustainability. So 4 simple principles that can guide any policy, not just the immigration policy. These are things that we can do as a nation, and it will help guide the debate. I think, to answer your question, it's a matter of education, and it will take a while, because some people actually, I have noticed, refuse to get educated. on issues, because it means they have to change their chosen prior beliefs, and that's very difficult.
I want to piggyback on what you're saying, because I think that there is this big elephant in the room, although not in the room, I guess, but which is that, and you know, we have two legislators here who can hopefully fill us in more on this, but you know, the sort of perceived wisdom, or the story that's being told right now, is that Chris Kobach, Federation of American Immigration Reform, the Immigration Reform Law Institute, that many of these bills that have been passed in state legislatures were sort of brought in from elsewhere. They may have been, you know, doctored or, you know, customized a bit, but that they came from someplace else. And there really is a strong but vocal movement in this country that wants to restrict immigration dramatically. And in doing that, I think, you know, I've had conversations with folks from early. Actually, we were on a panel at a law school right after SB 1070 passed, and they kept saying, well, you know, Arizona is just reinforcing and providing greater cooperation for federal law. We're not doing anything in Arizona that, you know, we don't already have the authority to do. And I said, well, if that's the case, then why is it so important to pass this bill? What good does it do for the people of the state? And he said, oh, we don't care about that. Literally, he said this. The entire room, their jaws dropped. He said, we don't care about that. What we care about is that we know we cannot win in Congress, and so we decided to take the battle to the states, and in doing that, we wanted to create an atmosphere that got people all riled up about this, get it into the courts, and try to win on restricting immigration through the courts. And they're pretty bold about saying that over and over again. And in fact, in Arizona, it literally said, attrition through enforcement, meaning we are going to do everything in our power to drive people out, will be the law of this state. So that's the other piece, and I should have said it before, but what Sam said really made me think of that, is that somehow or other we have to deal with that issue, and the fact that there are a lot of people who don't subscribe to the idea that immigration is a good thing.
Okay, now we're going to take some questions from the audience, and several of them ask some of the same sort of topics regarding, for instance, the expertise of the lawmakers in debating and crafting immigration law. One of the questions is very pointed. It says, you know, when lawmakers consult or seek quote-unquote expert testimony regarding immigration at public hearings, is there any requirement or standard an expert must meet in the way of education, training, experience, or knowledge? I thought about this question, and I remember I was covering Representative Holcomb, the House Non-Civil Judiciary Committee the other day, where Senator Loudermilk came in and presented his bill on banning the undocumented students from public colleges in Georgia, and he had to get up to leave to go vote on a matter on the Senate floor in the middle of the hearing. So the person he was consulting to his right, D.A. King, a private citizen, not a legislator, was left there to answer the remaining questions to the committee. Loudermilk was gone, and the committee was asking and answering their questions from Mr. King. He's president of the Dustin Inman Society, very knowledgeable about immigration. And the Dustin Inman Society, their stated purpose is that they are for the enforcement of immigration laws. I was curious about that, but back to this question, and this kind of fits in, I think, is this, you know, when they're seeking expert testimony in these committee meetings, Representative Holcomb, you know, what is there some requirement or standard for an expert that they must meet before they can testify in the way of, you know, training or experience or education on immigration? Same question to Senator Beasley.
The answer is no, and I think even the most brilliant expert, if what they said was contrary to the political views of the member of the committee, would just be ignored, and you see that happen all the time. And in terms of a parallel to the litigation context, you can always pay an expert to say something that you want, and so people just identify with what they want to hear and they ignore everything else. It's sad, but it's the way it works.
Beasley?
In Alabama, certainly in most pieces of legislation, you do have people with real good background in the subject But in the area of immigration, tell you what happened in the Alabama Senate. The cloture vote in Alabama Senate is when you shut off debate. Well, that happened almost 50 times in the Alabama Senate in 2011. They clotured the vote on the immigration law because, I mean, they were determined that they were going to pass this law regardless, and we only have 12 Democrats in the Alabama Senate and 22 Republicans and 1 independent. So it takes 21 votes to shut off debate, and during the very limited debate on immigration, they just shut it down. But in most cases in the committees, you do have people with good backgrounds to testify. But it didn't happen on the immigration law.
Dr. Addy, this falls into your wheelhouse. It says House Bill 59 and Senate Bill 458. They're likely to have a chilling effect on international students coming to Georgia. They pay much higher tuition than in-state students. Representative Holcomb mentioned that. The parents of those potential students may be or have influence with business and industry leaders in their home countries. They may elect to bypass Georgia and opt for friendlier states. What will be the economic impact to education, revenue, business, and travel as a result? I know we're not going to ask you to pick numbers out of the air, but this is a real consequence, is it not?
Right, and I will try to speak to that qualitatively because I haven't analyzed it, so I can tell you the direction, and it's quite clear. But Mary is sharing something with me here, which I would like to read to you. It says, immigrants are integral to Georgia's economy as students. Georgia's 14,707 foreign students contributed $384 million to the state's economy in tuition fees, living expenses for the 09-010 academic year, according to NAFSA. So we know that already. I conduct annual economic impacts of the University of Alabama. I've done that for the 4-year system as a whole in the state of Alabama. And yes, they do contribute. If you think about it, actually, the tuition they pay multiples of what in-state students pay. Even if you add in the appropriations from the state to in-state student tuition, it still doesn't come near these foreign students. One other statistic which I have heard hasn't changed much over 2 decades is that foreign students schooled in the U.S. often tend to stay in the U.S. even when they leave the U.S. for a while. Because one of the things the U.S. has is its institutions. It's very easy to live here. The rule of law is good here. Doing business is good here. Being innovative, inventive. So there's all that nice institutional structure that makes this country attractive. So actually, even though you might target the student during the years of training, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you don't, allow it, because the benefits come for years after they graduate. And if you want to see an example,
I want to move on to another issue we haven't touched on, which is really interesting, is the money at stake here in the private prison industry. Some of the questions hit on this point. It says, how much federal reimbursement does the state of Georgia and the various counties get for those who are held in ICE detention? I've reported on this subject, and I was fascinated by it. And I looked up my article I wrote when Dr. Addy was talking, so I had the numbers in front of me. But Corrections Corporation of America operates a jail in Stewart County, which is south of Atlanta. It's a small county, one of the more impoverished counties in the state of Georgia. And it's Corrections Corporation of America is a $1.6 billion business based in Nashville. And I'm reading from my story here where it says that federal taxpayers pay Stewart County $60.50 per inmate held at the jail per day through an agreement with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That works out to $97,000 per day based on the fiscal year's average daily inmate count at the time I wrote this article. The county, however, keeps only 85% per inmate per day for its administrative cost and pays Corrections Corporation of America the rest, or about $60 per inmate per day. Here's the real number here. Since 2007, the county has collected about $1.7 million through this arrangement. That represents more than half of that small county's $3 million annual budget. That is an integral part of that county's finances. Maybe Mary, I don't know if you studied the subject, but I'm fascinated by the subject and how this is actually a source of revenue for corporations in America.
It's actually not something I'm really familiar with. There is an organization that has an entire website where they just track CCA and other detention-related things. This is not the name of the website, but sort of one of the broad websites that deal with that is the Detention Watch Network. And they can kind of, if you go there, you can learn more about the other sources that are out there.
And I would just add one little piece I wrote about another federal program. It's like the State Alien Criminal Assistance Program, where the federal government reimburses counties and states that hold undocumented immigrants in their jails and their prisons. And what we found out is that this created a niche business for a company based in Texas that helps the counties and the states apply for these grants, essentially. We're taking 15% of the take that the counties and the prisons were getting of this money. I just had that in the paper just a week ago, and I was fascinated by that there's, these industries creating around this issue, private prison industry and the grant writing industry. That's all the questions we're going to have time for to take. I want to give our panel a round of applause. Thank you so much.
I want to thank the panelists again for coming from Washington, D.C., Alabama, spending time with us, educating us. As Dr. Addy said, it is a matter of education. Thank you to Emory Law School for hosting us tonight. I do want to thank Ayla and Gapaba and all our volunteers who organized the event. Erin Krinsky, are you here? She has some parting thank you gifts for the panelists. We have a wonderful reception outside. Thank you, Jeremy, again for moderating tonight. Thank you for all of you for coming here to be educated and to have this education from our wonderful panelists to form your own opinions about immigration and the laws for Georgia and Alabama. Thank you. The reception is outdoors, out in the lobby right here, so please join us.